This programme was produced and first aired on Access Manawatu with support from New Zealand On Air.
Community Access Radio. Access Manawatu.
Yes, excellent. So you're currently senior lecturer of at AUT.
Yes. That's
Psychology.
Right. Yes, that's right.
Excellent. And originally you're from Iran.
Yes.
Now, which part of Iran?
Tehran, the capital.
Tehran, okay.
Yep.
Okay. So, that's very interesting. I do actually want to ask you a little bit about...
No problem, absolutely.
But when did you leave Iran?
So we left in 91 and
okay.
I arrived in New Zealand a couple of months before turning 10 and we moved to Devonport, which is in the North Shore of Auckland.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, pretty much where I lived till I was about 18 or so, till I went to university and parents moved houses and things like that. But yes, so spent 10 years in Iran and the rest of the time in New Zealand.
So was that a big cultural shift?
Yeah, it was. I think when you're that young, things are quite easy to digest. You just kind of go with the flow and your parents are moving. And we came over with quite a few families. We came over with 4 families, which was my mum and our family, but then her 2 brothers and their family and her sister and their family. So for a couple of years, it sort of felt pretty good and fun because a lot of people were here from home and what have you. And both my uncles were sort of quite successful businessmen, so I think we all got bought in on a business visa, and they set up all sorts of ventures and bought property and did all sorts of things. But after a few years, they found that New Zealand was too far away from their other businesses and so on. So one of them moved to Sydney and the other one moved back to Iran, and their respective families did so too. And then so it was just our family and my auntie's family. And now she's in Melbourne and her kids are in Melbourne, my cousins. So yes, it's just really me and my mother and then my dad and his partner and that's left, and my brothers and sisters.
Right, and so you've established yourself.
Oh, absolutely.
In New Zealand, like
absolutely.
Would you consider jumping to Melbourne or Sydney?
Oh, you mean because my family's there?
Yeah, or for work or whatever. Or
I've always been pretty anti that idea. I've always thought if you're going to live in Australia but you're a New Zealander, and especially someone like me who spent such a long time studying and I guess establishing myself in the academic world of Auckland, why would I leave? But I guess you can never say never because you never know what opportunities would arise in the future. But I am aware of that whole, a lot of our talented, smart young people leaving, and I'm not into that. So I would not like to. I would like to not be someone who contributes to it. But the pressures are pretty high. I mean, I have a pretty big student loan. I'm definitely financially, I'm okay, and obviously on a relatively respectable income. But I sort of struggle. I'm not really able to save any money at the moment because I've got so much debt from studying so many years. And I even had a scholarship. I had a PhD scholarship. So my, and this was before postgraduate, studies weren't funded and all that kind of stuff. So I'm really worried about the generations under me, and talking to some of the young people yesterday at Massey and how they've been taking loans out even to pay to live, and which I never did.
Quite a thing, certainly, when I was studying a few years ago.
Yeah, we just did not do that. 8 years ago, you had the student allowance and you worked. You hardly ever tapped into the living costs from student loan because that was, seen as kind of silly. So I was quite shocked to hear yesterday at Musa that, a few of the students were into $70,000 of debt, and I think I left after a master's. I left with probably about 40.
Okay, which is still quite quite high.
Quite high, yeah.
Yeah.
I think 35, 40, something like that. And I think I'm just under 20, like paying it back or what have you. So I guess what I'm trying to say, the point of that story is, when you look at academic jobs in somewhere like Australia, someone at a senior lecturer position's probably getting about 100K or over starting, and that is quite a lot more than what you would get here in New Zealand. But I'm holding on and not going to jump ship because I believe, I believe in the cause. I love New Zealand, and I love where I'm from. I really cherish my heritage. It's such an important part of who I am, and I really think that part of the world is very important to me, and especially Iran. And I love Persian history.
That's so misunderstood, I think, in Western terms, especially with such idiotic movies like 300.
Oh, yeah. It's funny you should bring that up. I remember watching that, and I was kind of watching them going, who are these kind of weirdo, like, barbarians sitting there eating food off the floor or whatever it was. And then it was meant to be the Persians, and I was like, what? That's so historically inaccurate.
Well, one of the richest, oldest, civilizations that we still have.
Yes,
Yeah.
and also, I think one of the civilizations to actually introduce democracy and have a very humanitarian, humanistic approach to dealing with its citizens. And even when they conquered different places, it was really to take care of the people rather than kind of rape and pillage them, It was like, come with us, we will educate you, we will feed you, we will, give you a better life.
Well, I suppose on one level that explains why the Persian Empire as such didn't just fracture and disappear as fast as, say, Alexander of Macedonia.
Exactly.
The other thing about Iran that fascinates me, I don't know that much about it.
Yeah.
But it's got a very young population.
Yes.
And a huge youth population, and they're very smart, very they're kind of we think of Iran as being this kind of very conservative theocracy.
Yep.
Ruled by fatwas and other things, but it's really it's not
accurate.
It's not a very accurate portrayal.
No, not at all. I think, like anywhere, Iran is a complex place, and any kind of Western media coverage you ever get of Iran, I find frustrating and inaccurate, typically. Both in terms of my experience of living there and in terms of my experience of people that I know, and in terms of the internal reports that I get, or internal accounts of family members or friends or other groups of people, friends and family that we know. I think in terms of the area, Middle East, Iran is quite differently placed. It's the only place that isn't from an Arabic background. It's a Persian Farsi background. We speak a different language. We speak Farsi, and we have different cultural traditions than Arabic people, and obviously different Arabic nations have different traditions. But yeah,
it's been a big point of pride, hasn't it, keeping the language?
Yeah, Iran's the only place that speaks. The majority of the language is Persian or Farsi, and only Afghanistan is the other country in the Middle East that has Farsi as its main language, although they speak it with a slightly different accent. But if I could understand.
Right.
It's the same language. It's just with a slightly different accent. But I think Iran is probably it might sound cliche to say it, but highly misunderstood. It's got a very young population, very passionate, very politically engaged population. It's always been like that anyway. I remember being a kid, like 6 or 7 at my grandmother's breakfast table, and they're talking about this person and the politics, and then my uncle is not agreeing, and then my mum's going, what are you talking about? And the Conservatives against the Liberals, and it's just all this, and this is like 7 a.m. and you're like, oh my God, the day started. It's like, and sometimes, so everyone's very political, everyone's very passionate, very engaged, and in terms of, women outnumber men in universities. There's 60% of women in universities, and also there's a high proportion and representation of women in public and social life. They're not sort of in the home, just that's it. They're represented in Parliament, and they're represented in governmental institutions and any kind of other agencies, banks, shops, whatever it is. There's a high level of visibility, and so I think that's quite important to realise. And I know there are lots of restrictions. I mean, it is a theocracy, however, it is still a democratic theocracy, so people are elected into Parliament. And I think something that a lot of people don't know is actually every different subset of the Iranian population has representation in government. So there's actually a seat for an Israeli representative.
By law.
It must be by law, but basically whatever it is, that everyone has representative members of Parliament. There's an Israeli faction. There's a Jewish faction. There is a Christian faction, and other minorities are represented sort of percentage-wise in Parliament. So I think there's a lot of that rhetoric around that Iran is, or Muslims in general.
It's that Bushism axis of evil.
Islamophobia that they hate everyone. Yeah. So and I don't think that's the case at all. There's respect for other religions and representation. But one of the things that is difficult is, although it's a democracy, although people are elected in and they vote, there is still a religious council on top of the Parliament who does hold ostensibly a lot of power and could veto certain actions. And it's still not easy because they have to go with the populace, or they have to kind of follow what seems appropriate at the time. But that's one of the things that makes it a little bit more difficult. Yeah, having sort of a religious council or religious leaders and things like that, and having moralistic stances on, certain aspects of everyday life.
So when was the last time you visited?
I was 18, a long time ago now.
Wow.
I know, I'm desperate to go back for another visit. I'm just going to make some time. My grandmother's still in Iran, and I'd love to see her because she's quite elderly now, probably getting close to 90, and she was very much the head of our family and a powerful, amazing woman, and taught me a lot. And I would really like to see her again before it's too late.
Yes.
But also, it's been that's 15 years since I went back, so it'd be good to go back again. I'm sure a lot's changed. Yeah. And I've never done one of those things. I've been to lots of different parts of Iran, but I've never done the full explore the country tourist. Yeah. I haven't been to Persepolis.
And I suppose you'll be seeing it through not so much different eyes, but more complex eyes.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think when I went back the first time, I probably still had this fantasy that I was just eventually going to go back to Iran. I just thought, I'm in New Zealand. This is, I don't know, what I'm doing now. But I had this image in my head that I would always go back. And when I went back, I was actually 17 and I turned 18 over there. And, excuse me.
No worries. We'll edit that out.
Thank you. Hold on. Silly. Okay. I was 17 when I actually went back there, and I actually, I was actually a bit of a foreigner in my own country, so it took a lot of. You've got a bit of a different accent. When you speak, people can tell you've been overseas, abroad, and there are sort of just cultural codes of acting, or just your average, just things that you've lost touch with because you left when you were 10.
Right.
So
yeah, you feel a bit like more of an outsider.
Yeah, it was actually a little bit of a culture shock. And then after I spent about 4 months there, and coming back to New Zealand again was another culture shock because you start integrating into the Persian way of life. So it's all very confusing. But it did. It sort of made me cement myself in New Zealand a bit more and decide, okay, I want to stay here and study further, and then who knows what will happen what will happen down the track.